Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made his first official visit to Africa, meeting with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa this week. It marked a significant moment in Ukraine's diplomatic outreach to Africa. It also coincided with a rare telephone conversation between Ramaphosa and US President Donald Trump amid strained relations between the two countries. Zelensky's trip was, however, cut short following a devastating missile attack on Kiev, adding urgency to his mission. Well, joining us in the studio today to discuss the implications of these events is Christopher Vandome from Chatham House. Hi, Chris. So nice to speak to you again.
Good morning. Good to see you again.
So, what's your take on the significance of Zelensky's visit to South Africa? And how does that telephone conversation between Ramaphosa and Trump fit into this?
Well, obviously, this is a significant moment. Not only is it Zelensky's first visit to South Africa, but it's also the first visit of any Ukrainian president to South Africa for 33 years, since the start of diplomatic relations between the two countries. So that's something that's being really played up. It's also being played up because obviously, Cyril Ramaphosa has been trying for a long time to position himself as an interlocutor on this conflict. He spearheaded the African peace process. He's been lobbying hard, particularly on issues around food security and grain trade. And there were some agricultural elements of the discussions that happened. So, Cyril Ramaphosa has been trying to position himself as the go-to intermediary, but at times that has lacked international credibility, particularly given the South African position on Russia and the kind of rhetorical closeness between the two, the ANC in particular, and with the Russian government, and kind of talks of long-standing solidarity and friendship and so on. So that's got in the way of a more consolidated position by South Africa of really holding that middle ground and say, okay, well, we're the ideal intermediaries. So this is a really important and significant step in that direction. And perhaps one of the most important parts to come out of the conversation is the support for an unconditional ceasefire. So whereas before there's been discussions of conditional ceasefire, and that's something that Vladimir Putin has discussed and supported, and this idea that yes, we all want peace and we all want a ceasefire, but here are the conditions. Here is Zelensky saying, we would support an unconditional ceasefire, and here's Cyril Ramaphosa standing next to him saying, yes, that's something that we would also support. So, in terms of the kind of the diplomacy and the kind of the nuance around discussions on Ukraine and the peace process at the moment, that's possibly the most significant part of it. You're right to point out, there have been telephone calls in the days running up to this, both from Donald Trump and from Vladimir Putin. So, again, South Africa has been elevated to quite an important position. Whether or not it has the ability to continue this going forward, and whether or not it's got the diplomatic capabilities to kind of own a process is another matter. But this is a really important visit because of South Africa hosting the G20, because of South Africa's current position in international relations. This was it was an important thing to do for Zelensky. It was important to show the world that we're not as isolated as you think, and similarly for South Africa, it was important to show the US we're not as isolated as you want us to be. So for both sides, this is as much about posturing as it is about putting in place kind of serious diplomatic processes that will carry on going behind the scenes.
Well, Zelensky's trip was cut short because of a bomb attack on Kiev. So, do you think he had enough time to do this?
He had enough time to do the posturing and enough time to do the photo shoot and the press conference and the stuff that was important to be done for that positioning. Enough time for the handshake, for the talk, enough time for both sides to demonstrate that they're not isolated, that they these discussions are taking place. So the symbolism of it, that side was all achieved. In terms of what else could have been achieved via a longer visit, it's unclear, and it's unclear what for example, a South African vision of what a peace process might look like, beyond saying that, South Africa itself would be the right kind of interlocutor to be able to govern such a process. So yeah, it's still a bit scant on detail, and right from the outset, South Africa said, within days of the conflict breaking out, well, we've learned from our own experience, and we need mediation, and this is, from our experience, we see that conflicts lead into, or can lead into, a mutually hurting stalemate. So let's start the mediation process now. While the rest of the world was kind of saying, well, you know, is one thing to talk about peace, but right now we're right at the moment of an invasion, and we want to get Russian forces out of eastern Ukraine. Now it seems that particularly under Donald Trump coming full circle to to have to deal with some of these more practical realities, it's not a position that the Ukraine supports, but it is perhaps one that South Africa itself has been kind of talking about from the start. So, in order to, like I say, the symbolism of it, and the showing that yes, we're kind of now talking about these kind of issues, is really important. The fact that Zelensky then had to dash off back to Ukraine, I don't think really, I don't think it undermined the visit, and I don't think that there would be that much more that could have been achieved through his presence had he stayed longer.
Yeah, and they were both quick to say that they don't think that the bomb attack was because he was in South Africa.
Yeah, there were, and I think that they were right to do that. Obviously, it would have been, you know, there was a lot of speculation that, oh, is this because is Putin launching these attacks because you're in South Africa? Is this his way of trying to call you back? But it was pointed out that this happens all the time, and as much as Zelensky has been, doing the rounds and engaging internationally, he is also president of a country at war, so he needs to spend a lot of time with his people. So yeah, I don't think that this was connected.
Well, Ramaphosa was quick to go on social media to say, I spoke to Trump. Do you think the door has now opened for South Africa to resume diplomatic relations with the US?
I think it's opened the door, and I don't, but I don't know if it's South Africa's door to open. I think South Africa's been trying to knock on that door for months now. We've had, successive attempts by the South Africans to engage in Washington, including, very high level official visits. Talk about, Zane Dangor himself was there, and there have been attempts to try and rekindle that. And I don't think it's really up for it's not something that South Africa is unilaterally able to do, and it has been trying. It's now up to the American regime. This is really it is an important step in terms of re-engagement. It is important that these two countries are talking, and the two presidents are talking. They're talking about an issue that is separate, and also it's I've always thought that South Africa needs to choose its battles on where it places itself in terms of kind of contested international issues, and how it on which issues it is happy to kind of counter the US position, and know that by countering a US position that it's going to come under certain scrutiny. But then seeing, okay, well, where are the issues where perhaps, even if it's an ideological position, it just needs to be kind of downplayed a little bit, or not so confrontational on US interests. And the ICJ case against Israel is clearly, for the Trump regime, that's the number one issue around South Africa. That's really what they're interested in. So it's good that there's been this phone call, and it's good that perhaps both sides seeing a bit more pragmatic reality. Certainly, I think in terms of where Trump sees the conflict playing out, and the possible cessation of territory, and Russian holding that territory in the eastern Ukraine and the Donbas regions is certainly something that South Africa has been, or the South African position has been more amenable to right from the outset. And so, clearly there's an alignment there. Whereas, if you look at most European countries, and certainly the news in the UK at the moment is all around, well, how could this possibly happen? And Ukraine must hold territorial integrity and sovereignty, and that's something that the South Africans haven't been pushing so loudly. So there is some kind of connection there for Trump. So important for the conversation to happen on this issue. But in terms of UK South Africa, in terms of US South Africa relations, we're still a long way from any form of kind of real recovery and real kind of reconnection. And there's a lot of other things that would need to happen for that.
So, what do you think South Africa should do in terms of a new ambassador to Washington and this US envoy, which is Mitsubishi Jonas? Are they taking the right steps to try to re engage with the US?
I think, one thing South Africa should do is not rush into this. Yes, there's been a lot of speculation around who should take over that ambassadorial position. You're right to say there's been a lot of speculation about some very prominent Afrikaner males from within the regime, and the kind of, you can see the South African kind of gaming it out of, well, while the American regime is pushing this narrative around the persecution of Afrikaners in South Africa, wouldn't it confuse them if we sent an ANC-linked white Afrikaner male? Wouldn't that confuse them, and wouldn't that help to get the point across of our narrative, and to say, oh, you're misinterpreting in your narrative, and this is our view, and so on. So there's a lot of conversation around, or there's been some conversation around that. But the reality is, I think that they need to, they need to call for a bit. It's not just about who the ambassador is going to be. There's a lot more that needs to be discussed, and with the appointment of Mitsubishi Jonas as the envoy, you've got to think, well, is this really the most positive step that they could have taken? And you can see that particularly some of the more kind of right-wing coverage in the US is deeply skeptical about that appointment, and it's unclear as to whether that's really going to be able to gain traction in the US. So I do think that South Africa, it's time to kind of settle down into, okay, let's focus on the G20. Let's try and get the US engaged on G20 issues. Let's push the fact that the G20 isn't just about South Africa, but it's about kind of wider collaboration. And let's see how we can progress on that front. But a kind of an all-out kind of reactionary position taking on the US is seemingly not working, and the rhetoric has continued, and there hasn't really been a change on the American position. And even where earlier this year, where some of these announcements were being made, it was kind of, oh, well, Trump's just making these grand rhetorical statements in order to try and put pressure, and it's all part of the deal. But actually, it's becoming more entrenched, and the position in America is harder than I think many South Africans realize, and it's going to take a lot more than kind of a savvy ambassadorial appointment to change that. It's going to take a lot of behind the scenes work, and it's going to take, again, South Africa is going to have to think, well, what is in our national interest in terms of our economic interest? What is it that we want out of a relationship with the US? And what are some of the political compromises that we might have to make in terms of our ideological positioning on certain issues in global affairs? Which, again, I think, both for the US and for some of the European partners, there has been a frustration that, these are live issues affecting people in Europe, or live issues that are affecting kind of direct US national security interests. And South Africa has been seen as a country that is, far away from these, unable to necessarily contribute kind of militarily, financially, or so on. But taking positions and adding moral credence because of South Africa's own history. is able to add that moral credence and elevate, on a moral platform, some of these positions, which does frustrate some of those international, partners. So, it's going to take a lot more.
The G20 that you mentioned, I mean, so far the US have shunned it and they've not sent people to meetings. So, any chance that Trump would arrive end of the year for the G20 summit in South Africa?
Or proper crystal ball time with that one. Look, I think
Mm.
I don't think that it's as hard a no as as it could be. I think that there is, that door is still open, and I think that there has been real, again, part of the conversation, I believe, with between Ramaphosa and Trump was, come to South Africa, and obviously that would be the right time. I think that South Africa would have to at least indicate that it was, listening to certain US kind of requests on certain things. But it's really, really difficult for them. I think that, its position on the ICJ is one that is kind of, there's a wide support within South Africa for the broader Palestinian cause of the people who are oppressed, and that narrative is very strong in South Africa. There's less of a nuanced understanding of kind of, you know, who are the true representatives of the Palestinian people, the separation between support for Palestine and support for Hamas, that the issue, the depth and nuance of the issue, I don't think is necessarily fully understood or appreciated, but there is a broad understanding or broad support for, support for Palestine, and clearly kind of, the resonance of Mandela, South Africa is not free until Palestine is free, plays out politically very strongly in South Africa. So it is going to be a big ask for them to shift a position on that front. And in terms of, some of the other issues that America has raised around ownership, and not just land ownership, but kind of business ownership and some of the empowerment legislation, that's deeply entrenched within kind of the South African political economy, and is going to take a long time to overhaul. But again, on that front, there are political pressures from within the country for an overhaul of that system. So I think South Africa is going to have to, if it really wants to bring America back on board, it's got to offer something. It's got to say, this is what we've got, rather than being in a reactionary mode of, well, if you don't want us, then we'll shoot our mouth off about you. It needs to get over that initial period of the of being under attack, and move to one of, okay, well, what have we got to offer, and what can we do to try and mend this relationship.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks so much for speaking to us.
Perfect. Thank you so much.